July 19th, 1989, the middle of the day. A wide-body McDonnell Douglas DC-10 lifts off the runway at Stapleton Airport in Denver. United Airlines logos run down its sides, and the flight plan reads Flight 232, routed through Chicago and on toward the eastern side of the country, all the way to Philadelphia. The plane climbs into the sky at 9 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, local time. An ordinary summer flight, one of thousands crossing America that day. There are 296 people on board, 285 passengers and 11 crew members. Among the passengers are families with children, people on vacation, people traveling for work. Not one of them suspects that within an hour, this flight will go down in aviation history. In the cockpit sits one of the most experienced crews you could ask for. The captain, Alfred Haynes, who everyone simply calls Al, is 57 years old. He has nearly 30,000 flight hours behind him, more than 7,000 of them on this very DC-10. Beside him is First Officer Bill Records and Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak, the man responsible for the aircraft systems. All three have taken this type of plane into the air many times before. The aircraft itself, registration N1819 uniform, rolled off the assembly line back in 1971. Across 18 years of service, it has logged over 43,000 hours. A proven machine, one that has been through maintenance again and again. 3 General Electric engines of the CF6 series carry the airliner at a cruising altitude of around 11 kilometers, 2 beneath the wings and 1 in the tail, at the base of the fin. In the cabin, drinks are being served. Beyond the windows lies a flat blue sky over the plains of the Midwest. The instruments read normal. The engines run like clockwork. No one expects trouble. And that is exactly why what is about to happen in the next minute will catch the crew completely off guard. What would have to fail on a perfectly sound airliner to turn it, in a matter of moments, into an uncontrollable machine? 3:16 in the afternoon, local time. The airliner is flying at around 83 hundredths of the speed of sound, when a sharp bang rolls through the entire airframe. The aircraft is shaken so hard that the instrument needles jump in the cockpit. The hum from the tail cuts off. Something very large has just torn itself apart behind them. The source of the shock is engine number 2, the one mounted at the base of the fin, between its 2 winged siblings. In the first few seconds, the crew reads the situation as routine. One of the 3 engines has failed. Unpleasant but not fatal. A DC-10 flies just fine on 2, and crews drill failures like this on the simulator hundreds of times. Flight Engineer Dvorak opens the manual and begins the standard procedure. Shut down the damaged engine, cut off its fuel supply, work through the systems. Haynes and Records hold the plane for now, expecting that things are about to stabilize. Logic points to a simple scenario. They have lost 1 engine, so they will land on the 2 that remain. But the aircraft is behaving wrong. On its own, with no input from the pilots, it banks to the right. The nose drops, and the airliner begins to descend. Haynes pulls back on the yoke, and there is almost no response. And then, the flight engineer notices something that sends a chill through the cockpit. The hydraulic pressure gauges, every single one of them, are creeping toward 0. All 3 systems are falling at once. On the instrument panel, the readings that by every calculation could never go dark are going dark. In a matter of seconds, a routine engine failure has turned into something the manuals do not even have a name for. Why would the failure of 1 engine bring down, all at once, every system that keeps a plane flying under control? To understand the full weight of the situation, you have to know how a DC-10 is built. On a large airliner, the pilot does not move the control surfaces directly. No human's muscles are strong enough for that. Every surface that turns and tilts the aircraft is driven by hydraulics. Fluid under high pressure pushing pistons. And the designers built in a triple margin of safety. 3 completely independent hydraulic systems. If one fails, there is a second and a third. Losing all 3 at once was considered impossible. On July 19th, the impossible happened. When the tail engine shattered, its fragments sprayed out in a fan and ripped through the rear of the aircraft. And right there, in the narrow space near the fin, ran the lines for all 3 hydraulic systems. The steel shards severed them one after another in fractions of a second. The fluid gushed out, the pressure dropped, and the triple margin of safety collapsed to nothing. What does that mean in practice? Almost everything failed, one piece after another. The elevators, which set the climb and descent, stopped responding. The ailerons on the wings, which control the bank, went dead. The rudder in the tail is useless. The flaps will not extend, and without them, you cannot slow down before landing. The brakes on the landing gear do not work. The yoke and the pedals under the pilot's feet are no longer connected to anything. They are just pieces of plastic and metal. Haynes turns the yoke from side to side, pulls it toward him, pushes it away. The plane does not respond. More than 170 tons of metal are hurtling across the sky, and in the cockpit there are 4 people, and not a single lever to change where it is going. The machine has a life of its own. It banks. It drops. What can you even steer with when not a single control surface works? The crew still has something alive to work with. The 2 engines under the wings, the left and the right, are running normally. The fragments from the tail engine never touched them. Their thrust still answers to the throttle levers in the cockpit. This is the only thing the men at the controls have left. Haynes starts to experiment. He adds thrust to the right engine, eases off the left, and feels the plane reluctantly begin to turn. He pushes one up, brings the other down, and the aircraft banks the way he wants. And so, on the fly, with no manual to guide them, the only available method of control is born. Steer with the difference in thrust. The left and right throttles are now the yoke and the pedals both. This method has a pitch dimension to it as well. Add thrust to both engines and the nose pitches up. Pull it back and the nose drops, and the plane goes down. So with the throttles, you can crudely manage both descent and climb. A faint hope appears of bringing the plane down to the ground. The trouble is that this control is monstrously imprecise. The plane rocks endlessly in pitch, in long, slow waves. First the nose rises and it loses speed. Then it pitches down and gains it. Airmen call this a phugoid oscillation. Any movement of the lever shows up not right away, but tens of seconds later. Every action has to begin early, guessing what the machine will do next. Haynes is flying the airliner like a heavy, sluggish barge on a churning river. The plane is constantly being pushed off to one side, and he has to keep nudging it back with thrust just to hold any kind of heading. It works. But to hold the plane this way all the way to the runway is a task beyond human strength. Will 2 throttle levers be enough to bring a heavy airliner to an airport? While the 3 men in the cockpit wage their war with the machine, a passenger is sitting in the cabin who understands the DC-10 better than most. Dennis Fitch, an instructor for United Airlines, who trains pilots on this exact type of aircraft. He has around 23,000 flight hours behind him. He is flying as an ordinary passenger, on his own business, and at first he takes the shaking for ordinary turbulence. But Fitch senses something is off. The plane has been banking for too long, and unnaturally, and the engines do not sound right. He calls over a flight attendant and asks her to pass word to the cockpit. There is a DC-10 instructor on board, ready to help. The message reaches Haynes at exactly the moment when the cockpit is desperately short of hands. The captain does not hesitate. He calls Fitch up. The instructor squeezes into the cramped cockpit and sees a picture that is hard to believe. Every hydraulic gauge reading 0. The pilots literally hanging on the throttle levers. Haynes explains in a few words that they have no control at all, except for the 2 engines. Fitch lowers himself between the seats of the captain and the first officer and takes both throttle levers, one in each hand. Now he controls the thrust, while Haynes and Records can at least hold the yokes and watch the instruments. And here is the strange part. Once, years ago, Fitch had heard about a similar case, and out of sheer boredom, he had played it through in his own mind, imagining how you would fly a plane on thrust alone. That game of the imagination has suddenly become his job for the next few minutes. Is it even possible to coordinate the actions of 4 men in a cockpit in the few minutes left before impact? A 4th man at the throttles changes the very atmosphere in the cockpit. Out of 3 exhausted pilots, yanking at dead controls, a team comes together in which each has his own area of responsibility. Fitch holds the thrust. Haynes commands and makes the decisions. Records works the yoke and the instruments. And Dvorak handles the radio, reads the charts, and runs through the options. They talk out loud, constantly. They call out every move, and double-check every suggestion together. No one pulls rank. No one stays silent for fear of being wrong. Someone proposes something, and the others immediately weigh it, argue, correct it. On the recording of the conversation, you can even hear short jokes slip through the tension. The men are deliberately letting off pressure so they do not crack. Later, Al Haynes will say a line that becomes a textbook quote. Among the 4 of them in that cockpit, there were 103 years of flying experience. and in not a single minute of those years had any of them practiced what they were having to do now. Flying a plane with no hydraulics is described in no manual, was never built into any simulator. They were inventing a way to survive as they went. The captain would say something else as well. In that situation, there was no point in a rigid chain of command, with one man giving orders and the rest carrying them out in silence. What carried the day was working together, 4 heads on one problem. Investigators will call that coordination exemplary, and will pick it apart for years as an example of how a crew should work when there is no way out. How do you keep a plane in the air long enough to reach an airport? Somewhere below, on the plains of Iowa, there is Sioux Gateway Airport, which Americans call Sioux City for short. The crew and the controllers quickly agree on it. It is the nearest suitable runway. There is still distance to cover, and every minute of that journey is won by a fight. On the ground, a race of its own begins. The controller steers every other aircraft out of the area, clearing the sky around the dying airliner. By voice, he guides the crew. He calls out headings and calmly reports the distance to the runway. Firefighters, ambulances, and rescuers are roused from across the region. Everything that can be gathered in a small city and its surroundings is pulled in, right down to National Guard units that happen to be nearby. In the air, the plane behaves like a willful animal. Holding a straight line is impossible. Time after time, the airliner falls off into a right turn and travels in wide circles, spiraling down and losing altitude. The crew cannot simply aim at the runway and descend. Any sharp reduction in thrust drops the nose, and then the airliner threatens to fall out of the sky entirely. They have to balance on a razor's edge between descending too fast and losing speed and falling. Fitch plays the levers with small, careful movements, dampening the bank and nudging the heading. Haynes is constantly calculating whether they fit the flight path. They cannot set the descent precisely, but in broad strokes the plane does answer to thrust. With every minute, the runway at Sioux City draws closer, and the less time there is left to decide exactly how to touch the ground. What will meet the plane at the moment it touches down, if it ever reaches the runway at all? When the runway finally appears ahead, the numbers on the instruments leave no illusions. The plane is coming toward the ground at around 220 knots, instead of the standard 140 for landing. It is moving noticeably faster than it should, and there is nothing to slow it with. Without hydraulics, neither the flaps nor the slats deploy, the ones that normally bleed off speed on the approach. The rate of descent is also far beyond any limit. The airliner is dropping at roughly 1,850 feet per minute, several times more than a soft landing allows. In essence, the machine is not landing but falling, in a controlled way, toward the runway. And the brakes on the gear are dead. There will be nothing to stop its roll once it touches down. The crew brings the plane in toward runway 22, a closed runway about 2 kilometers long, the very one where the equipment and the rescuers have been concentrated. It is not the ideal choice, but it is the only realistic one. The main thing is to hit a hard surface. The pilots understand how easy it would be to miss off to the side, since they have no precise control at all. In the final seconds, the very thing they feared most happens. The plane tips onto its right wing again, and there is nothing left to level it. There is no altitude, no time, and no controls left to stop the bank. In desperation, Fitch adds thrust, trying to lift the dropping wing. But the phugoid wave and the inertia of the enormous machine are stronger. The airliner comes down to the ground in a bank that no landing pattern ever allowed for. How will a touchdown at that speed and that bank end? 4 o'clock in the afternoon, local time. The banked wingtip is the first thing to catch the concrete. In that instant, all the energy of an enormous mass, flying far too fast, crashes into a single point. The wing snags the runway, the machine is wrenched around, and the airliner begins to break apart. The plane snaps and tumbles over the wing. Fuel from the punctured tanks ignites, and a fireball rises. The main body of the fuselage leaves the runway and slides into a cornfield beside the airfield. The tail and nose sections tear away from the body. Debris scatters across the field. A piece of fuselage flips upside down. What a moment earlier had been a whole aircraft is now fragments strewn across the ground. What happens next has to be told with restraint. There were 296 people on board. The impact was so violent that from the outside, it seemed there was almost no chance of surviving. Smoke rises over the field, visible from far away, and in those first minutes, from the outside, It looks like a catastrophe with no hope of rescue. But this is where everything they had prepared for so long on the ground came into play. Firefighters and rescuers are already standing ready right by the runway. They had been called out ahead of time, while the plane was still circling in the sky. They rushed to the wreckage within seconds of it stopping, without waiting for anyone to give the order. This readiness to meet the plane at the point of impact is what will separate a hopeless outcome from a chance at rescue. How many people can possibly be saved after an impact like that with the ground? When the first chaos on the ground dies down and the tally begins, the numbers astonish even people who have seen everything. Out of 296 people on board, 184 survived, 112 died, and 13 people walked out of the wreckage without a single injury. With a complete loss of control and an impact at an impossible speed, more than half survived, an outcome that few would have thought possible. The explanation comes down to several factors. The plane did, after all, reach a prepared airfield rather than crashing in open country. The crews stationed by the runway began pulling people out in those very first minutes, when the count is measured in seconds. And the structure of the wide-body airliner itself preserved, in several compartments, spaces where people survived. The passengers themselves did a great deal too. Some of them climbed out of the overturned, broken fuselage sections on their own, and immediately set about dragging out their neighbors, helping children, leading the injured to the rescuers. In the smoke and chaos of the cornfield, strangers pulled one another to safety. The entire flight crew survived as well, though the nose section with the cockpit was badly crushed in the impact, and rescuers had to extract the pilots from the damaged structure. The 4 men who fought for the machine to the very last second stayed alive, and were later able to tell exactly what had happened in the cockpit. The scale of what had been saved did not reach everyone right away, but out of this catastrophe, hundreds of people came out alive against all odds. And along with the count of survivors came the central question of the investigation. What exactly had broken in the tail of the plane, and could it have been foreseen? Now the story moves into the offices of the investigators. The job of working out the causes falls to the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent American agency that investigates major accidents and answers to neither the airlines nor the manufacturers. Its task is simple in words, not to find someone to punish, but to understand what happened and to make sure it never happens again. The chief witnesses for the investigation are mute. They are the flight recorders, the so-called black boxes, which are in fact bright orange so they are easier to find. There are 2 of them, and they are different. One, the flight data recorder, continuously writes down the instrument readings, altitude, speed, engine revolutions, the position of the controls. The other, the voice recorder, captures everything that sounds in the cockpit, the pilot's conversations, the reports, the background noises. Together they paint a picture, second by second, of what was happening to the machine and to the people. The experts lay these recordings out alongside the radio traffic and everything they were able to gather from the field. The debris is brought to one place and painstakingly laid out, as they try to understand in what order and from what the plane fell apart. Step by step, the chain is reconstructed. Here is the bang in the tail. Here is the drop in pressure. Here are the first attempts to fly on thrust. But one piece of evidence, the most important of all, is missing. The investigation does not have the key part, the fan disc from the tail engine, the very part whose failure set everything in motion. In the explosion, it was thrown clear of the plane, and it is nowhere on the field by the runway. Without that piece of metal, it is impossible to say for certain why it shattered. Where do you even look for a fragment that fell to Earth from a height of 11 kilometers? The search for the key part stretches on for months. It tore away while still in the air, long before the landing, and could have fallen anywhere across a vast stretch of land under the flight path. Combing an area like that in full is impossible, and the investigation rests largely on chance and on local residents. Chance arrives about 3 months later. A farmer, working his field near the town of Alta in that same Iowa, finds pieces of heavy metal that clearly have nothing to do with agriculture. These are the parts of the shattered fan disc. From Sioux City Airport to the site of the find is around 100 kilometers. That is how far the fragment was thrown when the engine came apart. By that point, the manufacturer, General Electric, had already announced a reward for finding the disc and its blades. It understood just how important it was. The recovered metal is sent for analysis. A metallographic examination, the study of the metal's structure under a microscope and in cross-section, reveals the main thing. There was a fatigue crack in the titanium disc. This is not an instant break from an overload, but a slowly growing fissure that had widened inside the metal for years, with every cycle of the engine's operation, until the part lost its strength and shattered at full power. And the crucial point, the crack did not grow out of nowhere. It began from a flaw embedded in the metal, back when the disc was made, almost 2 decades before the catastrophe. Now the investigation held in its hands not a theory, but a physical, tangible cause for everything that had happened on July 19th. Why was this hidden crack not found over years of routine inspections of the plane? The root of the whole tragedy turned out to be microscopic. When the titanium billet was smelted, the one from which the disc was later machined, a tiny foreign inclusion formed in the metal, a break in the uniform structure, a kind of hidden defect inside the part. From the outside, the disc looked sound and fit for service, but a weak point had been sitting in it from the very moment it was born. That was exactly what became the start of the crack. Every startup, every spin up to speed, every landing, and the fissure crept invisibly deeper, eating away at the disc's reserve of strength, until that reserve was no longer enough even for the ordinary loads of cruising flight. Over its years of service, the disc had been removed and inspected during maintenance more than once. There were procedures for inspection and methods for finding hidden cracks, and yet the crack was never spotted. It was missed during the inspections. In some places, the checks were not thorough enough. In others, the method simply could not reveal the flaw, and the dangerous part went back onto the wing time after time. In its final conclusion, the NTSB will name exactly this as the primary cause of the disaster: shortcomings in quality control during the inspection of the disc, which meant the growing fatigue crack was not detected in time. The human factor, so often talked about when it comes to pilots, failed here not in the cockpit, but on the ground, years before the flight, during the inspection of a single part. This finding is set down in the official report under the designation AAR 90-06. Was one hidden defect really enough to bring down the entire control of an aircraft? The burst disc on its own does not explain all the horror. An engine can fail. It is a rare but known event, and the plane is supposed to survive it. So the investigation went further and uncovered a second weakness, no less important. It was this that turned the failure of a single part into the loss of the whole machine. The matter lay in the hydraulic layout itself. The DC-10 did have redundancy, but in the area of the tail, all the lines came together too close to one another, in one narrow space at the base of the fin. The designers assumed that severing them all with a single blow was unrealistic. On July 19th, it became clear how fragile that assumption was. The shattered disc threw its fragments out in a fan, and that fan passed straight through the very zone where all 3 hydraulic lines converged. One burst of fragments cut out all the redundancy at once. Protection designed to handle the failure of any single system was powerless when the fragments took them all out together. And so it became clear that the catastrophe was made up of 2 overlapping causes. A hidden defect in the metal destroyed the engine, and the vulnerable placement of the hydraulic lines turned that destruction into a total loss of control. A scenario that engineers had considered all but impossible played out in seconds. And the lesson turned out to be broader than make parts without cracks. You have to protect not only the part itself, but the routing of critically important systems, so that a single blow cannot wipe out every backup at once. So what was changed in aviation to make sure this would not happen again? The lessons from that Iowa field grew into concrete technical solutions. DC-10 aircraft were fitted with hydraulic fuses, valves that monitor for a fluid leak. If a line is punctured and the pressure is falling rapidly, such a valve seals off the damaged section, keeping the system from emptying completely. Even with a breach, at least some pressure is preserved, and with it, some of the controllability that the crew of 232 never had at all. They also tackled the cause of the failure itself. Inspections of the fan discs were made mandatory and more thorough, with an emphasis on finding precisely those hidden fatigue cracks. Production was changed too. The manufacture of titanium discs was moved to a cleaner technology, with triple vacuum remelting, to minimize the very inclusions in the metal that had started it all. But perhaps the most famous legacy of Flight 232 was not the hardware. The way 4 men in the cockpit, without a single instruction, organized themselves to work together became a model for the industry. The experience of this flight pushed forward the development of CRM, the training of crews in coordinated teamwork, dividing up the tasks, openly discussing decisions, and not pinning everything on a single captain. The coordination born in that cockpit under pressure has been studied for years on training courses around the world. The story of Sioux City entered the textbooks from two sides at once. From the technical side, as an example of how a hidden defect and a vulnerable design can combine into a catastrophe. And from the human side, as an example of what a team is capable of when it acts with flawless coordination in a hopeless situation. Was it even possible to repeat what this crew did that day? The answer to that question was sought not in the sky, but in the simulators. After the disaster, the situation of Flight 232, a complete loss of hydraulics with control by the differential thrust of two engines alone, was loaded into simulators many times and handed to experienced pilots to play out. The experiment was meant to show how realistic it was to land such a machine. The result was harsh. Time after time, trained crews lost the controllable aircraft on the approach, never bringing it to the runway. Some fell into a phugoid wave. Others could not cope with the endless rolling to the right. Others reached the ground in a way that no one could have survived. Not one crew in the simulator managed to repeat what Haynes and his team had done, to land the airliner so that the people lived. From this comes a sober conclusion. A landing on differential thrust alone was deemed practically impossible as a standard technique. It is not a method you can teach and rely on. The fact that Flight 232 even reached the runway and that hundreds of people survived lies somewhere on the edge between skill and luck. That is what the participants themselves said too. Both Al Haynes and Dennis Fitch repeated more than once that in their case, a great deal came down to a fortunate set of circumstances. Two working engines, a nearby airfield, ready rescuers, and that rare frame of mind that came together in the cockpit as if on its own. They did not see themselves as heroes who had turned fate around, but rather as men who did everything they could and who got lucky at several key moments. Flight United 232 remained in the history of aviation as one of the rarest cases in which a crew held a fundamentally uncontrollable machine in the air and brought it down to the ground. And to this day, it stands on the thin border between two questions. Where does the limit of human ability run here, and where does pure chance begin? One switch left in the off position, a part no bigger than your finger, and an aircraft carrying nearly 80 people that raced down the runway but never managed to climb. On January 13, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737, was leaving snowbound Washington for sunny Florida, and it crashed into a bridge in the heart of the Capitol, just minutes from the White House. And here's the most chilling part. Seconds before it happened, the first officer said out loud that the instruments looked wrong. He was heard. And they took off anyway. So, what turned an ordinary flight into a trap? Ice on the wing? A fooled sensor? Or the silence in the cockpit? And how did strangers on the bank of a frozen river give an answer of an entirely different kind that very evening? By the middle of that January day, a snowstorm is raging over Washington. At the city's national airport, just a few minutes' flight from the White House and the Capitol, Air Florida Flight 90 is getting ready to depart. It's a Boeing 737-222, tail number November 62 Alpha Foxtrot, and it's supposed to carry its passengers out of the frozen city and into the sun, to Tampa and on to Fort Lauderdale. There are 79 people on board, 74 passengers and 5 crew members. Many of them are flying home, toward the warmth, some with children in their arms. That morning, 6.5 inches of snow had come down on the city. The airport was closed, then opened again, and the flights had piled up into one dense traffic jam. For several hours, the aircraft alternated between waiting to be de-iced and standing in the runway queue under the relentless snowfall. When clearance finally comes, the plane begins its takeoff roll. After that, everything happens in a matter of seconds. The Boeing rolls down the snow-covered runway slowly, as if something is holding it back by the tail. It barely lifts off, noses up, and then fails to gain altitude. For a few seconds, the plane skims over the river, losing speed, and then it clips the 14th Street Bridge. This happens at rush hour, above a Potomac choked with cars. The aircraft breaks apart and disappears beneath the ice of the river, in the very heart of the American capital. From the outside, it all looks inexplicable. The plane is sound, the engines are running, experienced pilots are at the controls, and the weather, foul as it is, has cleared the flight for takeoff. Yet a flight that should have lasted hours ended seconds after lifting off. Less time passed between the takeoff clearance and the impact with the bridge than it takes for a cup of coffee to go cold. So, where exactly was the failure hiding? What robbed the plane of the power to climb, when every instrument read normal? To understand how this ended, let's go back to the morning of that day. The snow in Washington had started before dawn and was coming down like a wall. Visibility drops. The runways drift over faster than the crews can clear them. Every time the airport reopens after another pause, the line of departures grows. Dozens of flights are stuck. Passengers wait for hours. The schedule long ago stopped meaning anything. And it's in this jittery crush that the Boeing 737 is being readied for its flight. The plane itself is beyond suspicion. This airframe was built back in 1969. It had flown long and without incident for United Airlines. And in 1980, it was bought by a young Florida airline. The aircraft is in working order. It's been serviced, with no deferred faults that could have been the trigger. The engines are fine. The systems are working. Any theory about a hidden mechanical breakdown finds nothing to stand on here. Two professionals are at the controls. Captain Larry Wheaton, 34 years old, with around 8,300 flight hours, more than 1,700 of them on this type of aircraft. Beside him is First Officer Roger Pettit, 31, a former military pilot. He had flown the F-15 fighter and been an instructor in the U.S. Air Force. On paper, a solid, experienced crew with no red flags. And yet one detail matters. Air Florida is a Florida airline, and its skies are usually warm and clear. Snow, ice, ground de-icing against ice buildup. These were rare and unfamiliar work for these pilots. Their total flight time is enormous, but their experience with winter, iced-up departures in particular, is modest. On an ordinary day, that wouldn't have mattered. But this day was anything but ordinary. What's more frightening in the sky, a faulty plane or a crew unused to snow? Before departure, the aircraft has to be cleaned off. In freezing temperatures and snow, a crust of snow and ice settles on the wing, and it's removed with de-icing fluid, a hot mixture sprayed under pressure. It melts what is stuck on, washes the snow off the surfaces, and for a short time keeps new ice from forming. The key word here is short. That day, the plane was de-iced in a hurry. The procedure was started, interrupted, then resumed, and in the chaos of an overloaded, half-closed airport, it came out ragged. But the real trouble lay ahead. After de-icing, the plane didn't go straight to takeoff. It got into a long line and waited a long time for its moment under the continuing snowfall. The protective mixture doesn't work for hours. It drains away and loses its strength in a matter of tens of minutes. All that time, fresh snow was quietly settling on the wings, and ice was forming. Why is a thin crust on the wings so dangerous? It's not so much about weight as about aerodynamics. The wing lifts the plane by means of a smooth flow of air that clings to its surface. Even roughness as thin as sandpaper breaks that flow. It separates earlier, swirls, and the wing loses part of its lift. Ice turns a perfectly calculated surface into a rough, uneven one, and the wing stops holding the way it should. By the time the Boeing finally moved toward the runway, its wings were almost certainly coated over again. From the outside, it might have looked like a light dusting, but in reality, the plane's death sentence had been signed long before it would leave the ground. The ice that, by the rules, should not have been on the wing at the moment of takeoff was already sitting there. How long can a de-iced plane stand in the snow before the protection becomes useless? On the apron, a strange struggle begins. The plane needs to be pushed back from the terminal, but the tug spins its wheels. They slip on the iced-over surface, and the heavy aircraft won't budge. The tractor strains, but nothing comes of it. And so the crew makes the first of its fatal decisions. To help the tug, the pilots briefly engage reverse thrust on the engines, directing the thrust forward, trying to break the plane loose. This flatly contradicts the manual. Using reverse to move on the ramp is forbidden, and the consequences are exactly the ones the instructions warned about. The jets of reverse thrust kick up a cloud of snow around the plane, and according to the investigation's findings, it was this maneuver that may have driven extra snow straight into the engine intakes, right where it's most dangerous. Then comes another departure from the rules. Taxiing toward the runway in the long line, The captain brings his Boeing right up close behind the tail of the plane ahead. The reasoning is simple. The hot exhaust from the other plane's engines will melt the ice on his own aircraft. It sounds logical, but it's a trap the operating manual warns about directly. The hot stream really does melt the snow and ice, but the meltwater runs down into the cold cracks and gaps, and there it freezes again, sometimes harder than before. Each of these actions on its own seems like a trifle. Give a nudge with reverse thrust, warm up off someone else's exhaust, skip going back for one more de-icing. Not one of them, by itself, brings a plane down. The trouble is that they were quietly adding up, one on top of the next. That evening, the gaps in the protection lined up into a single, open corridor, and the plane was already moving down it toward the runway. How does a set of harmless, rule-bending add up into a deadly trap? Now we have to look inside the engine, where the real cause was hiding. At the inlet of each 737 engine sits a small sensor, the PT-2 probe. It measures the pressure of the air entering the engine, and from that pressure, an instrument in the cockpit calculates the thrust, a parameter called EPR. Put simply, this sensor is how the pilot sees how much power the engine is producing. A tiny thing, but it's exactly what tells the crew the one thing that matters, whether the engine is pulling for takeoff or not. In freezing cold, such a probe can ice over, and then it starts to lie. To keep that from happening, the plane has a separate engine heating system. In English, engine anti-ice. It's turned on with a simple motion, a switch in the cockpit. The checklist before startup has a direct item. In icing conditions, this heating must be turned on. That day, the crew didn't turn it on. This isn't a guess, it was established for certain. On the cockpit voice recording, you can hear the pilots go through the checklist and leave the system off. And in the wreckage, the heating valves were found in the closed position. They're moved by electric motors, and the impact couldn't have shifted them. The engines were running with no protection against ice. After that, it's simple physics. The snow and ice, which there was more than enough of on this plane, clogged the PT-2 probes on both engines. The blocked sensor stopped measuring the real inlet pressure and began showing a value that was too low. And a low pressure is what the instrument converts into an inflated thrust reading. Tests would later show the exact numbers. With a clogged probe, the instrument shows an EPR of about 2.04, while the engine is actually putting out only about 1.70. The pilots saw full takeoff power. The engines were delivering noticeably less. The deception was already at work before the plane even moved. Can a single switch left off fool an entire crew at once? A little after 4 in the afternoon, the Boeing rolls onto the runway and begins its takeoff roll over the packed snow. Both pilots are watching the instruments, and here, the cockpit recording preserves a grim exchange, because the man beside the captain senses trouble ahead of time. The first to raise the alarm is First Officer Roger Pettit, that same former fighter pilot. Looking at the thrust gauges, he says, "God, look at that. That doesn't seem right, does it?" Captain Wheaton answers briefly and calmly, telling him everything's fine. But Pettit doesn't let it go. "No, I don't think that's right." He keeps coming back to the thought, again and again. Something in the readings clearly doesn't match what he's feeling during the acceleration, and his instinct isn't wrong. The plane moves down the runway, sluggishly, heavily, as if reluctantly. The instruments say takeoff thrust, all normal, but by the slow way the speed is building, the plane is plainly short on power. The pilot is catching, with his whole body, a contradiction that isn't on the dials. The voice of doubt in the cockpit speaks up several times, clearly and out loud. But the takeoff isn't aborted. Only the captain has the right to call off the roll, and Wheaton doesn't call it. Maybe he trusts the instruments more than his colleagues' unease. Maybe it's the strain of the long wait and the wish to finally get airborne. Or maybe Pettit's doubt came out as a question, not a command, and was left hanging in the air without an answer. The cockpit had everything it needed to stop, numbers that didn't add up, and a man who said so out loud. Just one thing was missing, for someone to turn the doubt into action. Why didn't an alarm spoken aloud seconds before liftoff stop the takeoff roll? The numbers of the takeoff roll bear out what Pettit was feeling. Normally, a heavy 737 needs about 30 seconds to reach liftoff speed. That evening, it took around 45. The plane rolled unusually long and unusually heavily, the speed building lazily. Where 3,500 feet of runway is usually enough, the plane ate up nearly 5,400, most of the entire length. That's what a shortfall of thrust looks like from the outside. a shortfall that wasn't visible on any dial. When the Boeing finally lifted off, the trouble became visible. The control column immediately began to shake in the cockpit. The so-called stick shaker had gone off, a tactile signal that the plane is on the verge of a stall. It's the wing's last warning. Just a little more, and the airflow will separate completely, and the lift will vanish. This is where both of this flight's disasters come together. The ice on the wing tore the airflow loose prematurely and stole part of the lift. The thrust shortfall from the fooled probe left the plane without the power to compensate. The plane noses up, trying to climb, but it has nothing to hold itself in the air with. The higher the nose pitched up, the more the airflow separated from the iced-over wing, and the deeper the plane slid toward a stall. For a few seconds, the 737 hangs over the frozen river at just a few dozen meters. It doesn't drop like a stone, but it doesn't climb either. It hangs at the limit, losing the speed it never had enough of. The crew pulls the column back, wringing everything they can out of the plane. But you can't cheat physics. There isn't enough lift and thrust to pull a fully loaded plane off the water. The altitude it reached turned out to be nearly all the altitude it was ever going to get. And straight ahead, on its course, is the bridge. What must a pilot feel when the plane is in the air but refuses to fly? Below is an ordinary winter evening in a big city. The clock reads 1 minute past 4. The 14th Street Bridge, spanning the Potomac, is jammed with cars, people heading home, the traffic crawling bumper to bumper in the snowfall. None of them is looking up at the sky. None of them knows that a plane that can no longer climb is coming in low over the road. The Boeing clips the bridge. It tears away about 30 meters of railing and catches the stream of cars. Several vehicles on the span are struck. For the people on the bridge, the disaster comes with no warning at all. 4 of those who were simply going about their business are killed. Had the plane come down 100 meters off to the side, there would have been none of these victims. The flight's catastrophe reached beyond its own bounds. The plane itself breaks apart on impact and goes down through the thin ice into the river's frozen water. Almost everything vanishes beneath the surface in a matter of moments. On the surface, among the wreckage and the spilled fuel, only part of the tail remains, and a handful of people who managed to get out of the sinking plane are clinging to it. The water is right at the freezing point. It's bitter cold outside, and there's snow all around. And the city, in these minutes, is already stretched to its limit. The snowstorm has paralyzed traffic, the roads are at a standstill, and the rescue vehicles can't push through the jams to the river. And, as if that weren't enough, about half an hour later, a subway train derails in the center of Washington, a separate accident with fatalities. The capital gets 2 disasters in one evening, and the rescuers' forces are torn between them. At the frozen river, a small group of survivors clings to a piece of the tail, and for them, time is running down to minutes. Who will reach out a hand to the drowning when the whole city has come to a dead stop in the snow? Getting to the people in the water seemed impossible. The ice on the Potomac was too thin to hold a rescuer on foot, and too thick for boats to pass freely to the open water by the wreckage. The bank was buried in snow, the cars were stuck in traffic. The survivors were separated from land by only a few dozen meters, and those meters became nearly impassable. Rescue came from above. A small Park Police helicopter with the call sign Eagle 1 came out to the river, with 2 men aboard, pilot Donald Usher and his partner Melvin Windsor. The aircraft wasn't built for work over water in conditions like these, but there was no other option, and the crew took the risk. The helicopter hovered right over the open water, dangerously close to the surface, and began lowering a rescue line and ring to the people drowning below. What these 2 did next goes beyond ordinary duty. Windsor would stand on the helicopter's landing skid and, leaning down toward the very water, help people grab hold and lift them up. Usher held the aircraft steady in the wind, in the snowy haze, right at the river's edge, keeping it from settling. They dragged the survivors to shore literally one at a time, coming back over the open water again and again. Each pass was a race against time. The icy water quickly drains a person's strength, and help had to reach them within a matter of minutes. Here, people fought for the lives of others out in the open, in the elements, over the black water, risking themselves for strangers. Their work that day would go down in history as one of the most desperate aerial rescue operations. What will a helicopter crew go through to save strangers out of a frozen river? There is a hero in this operation whose face almost no one ever saw. Among those clinging to the piece of the tail was a middle-aged man. Each time the helicopter dropped him the line, he passed it on to others, to a woman, to the man beside him, to whoever was near. The rescuers lifted out several people in turn, and every time he sent the rescue on to someone else, staying in the water himself. When the helicopter came back for him one last time, he was gone. He had slipped beneath the water. For a long time, this man couldn't be identified, and in the news reports, he remained simply the man in the water. His name came out later, Arland Williams, a bank examiner, 46 years old. He had never been trained to rescue anyone. He simply chose, every single time, not to save himself, and for that, he gave his own life. And on the bank, another scene was unfolding. Among the survivors was Priscilla Tirado. She had lost her husband and her small child in the crash, could barely see because of the spilled fuel, and was hardly holding on to consciousness. The helicopter was towing her toward the bank on the ring, but her strength gave out, and she couldn't hold on. She ended up back in the water. And then an ordinary passerby leapt out of the crowd on the embankment. Lenny Skutnik, an office worker who happened to be there, dove without a second thought into the icy Potomac, fully clothed, and swam to the drowning woman. He hauled Tirado to the bank and pulled her out alive. He had no equipment, no training, just 1 second in which he decided he would not stand by and watch. That evening, the survivors could be counted on one hand, and every life hung on someone else's decision. What makes one person freeze on the bank and another throw himself into the water in a fraction of a second? When the water went still, the scale of what had happened became clear. Of the 79 people on board, only 5 survived, all of them thrown clear of the sinking plane and able to cling to the piece of the tail until help arrived. Among the saved were flight attendant Kelly Duncan and passengers Joe Stiley, Bert Hamilton, and Priscilla Tirado. They were pulled from the river in the very last possible minutes. The other 74 people on board died. To them were added the 4 on the bridge, those who were going about their own business and ended up in the path of the falling plane. In all, the disaster claimed 78 lives. Both pilots died too. The recording from the cockpit preserved their last words. Already over the river, Pettit says, "Larry, we're going down," and Wheaton answers, "I know." Less than a minute passed between the first officer's alarm during the takeoff roll and that line. The name of Arland Williams refused to be forgotten. That span of the 14th Street Bridge, the one the plane crashed into, was officially named in his honor, the Arland Williams Memorial Bridge. So the man who gave up his place in the rescue to others lived on in the name of the crossing beneath which he drowned. Lenny Skutnik's story went differently. Just days after the disaster, the president invited him to Congress, to the annual State of the Union address, and seated him beside the First Lady. That gave rise to a tradition. Ever since, ordinary people who have done something extraordinary are invited to sit in that chamber as a living example. The act of a chance clerk from the embankment turned into a symbol that outlived the disaster itself. 5 survivors, 78 dead, 1 nameless hero, and 1 chance passerby. That is how this evening stayed in memory. And it was time to lay it all out, piece by piece, coldly, by the evidence. What set the survivors apart from the dead? Calculation, luck, or someone else's sacrifice? When the elements receded, the investigators got to work. The recorders were pulled from the icy river and decoded. And from the recordings, every second of the fatal takeoff roll was reconstructed. They faced the same question that had nagged at the viewer from the very start. How could 2 perfectly good engines fail to lift an ordinary plane into the air? The answer came together from the evidence like a mosaic. The position of the valves in the wreckage proved that the engine heating had been off. The cockpit recording showed that the crew knew about the troubling numbers but didn't stop the takeoff. And the tests on a stand provided the missing link. The investigators recreated a snow-clogged PT-2 probe and measured what it shows. The numbers on the stand matched the very gap that doomed the flight. The instrument was overstating the thrust while the engine pulled at half strength. It lied in exactly the way needed to keep the pilots from suspecting a thing. The most bitter finding was how easily the whole thing could have been broken off. A single flick of a switch would have been enough, and the thrust needles would instantly have dropped sharply before the crew's eyes. And that very drop would have told the pilots that the numbers couldn't be trusted. Instead, one iced-over probe at an engine inlet fooled both instruments at once and everyone in the cockpit. And yet the main culprit wasn't the machinery. The probe didn't break. It did exactly what an iced-over sensor does. The plane had no hidden defect. The disaster was assembled out of a chain of human decisions. Ice left on the wing, the heating switched off, trust in lying numbers, and a takeoff that wasn't called off despite the alarm. Each link, on its own, could have been broken. Not one of them was. Can a part no bigger than a finger decide the fate of a plane with nearly 80 people aboard? The official conclusion boiled the tragedy down to a few dry lines. The cause was given as the crew's failure to turn on the engine heating during ground operation and takeoff, the decision to take off with snow and ice on the wings, and the captain's failure to abort the roll once attention had already been drawn to the incorrect instrument readings. A separate line addressed the failure in the cockpit. The captain ignored the first officer's alarm about numbers that didn't add up. From this disaster came lessons that today seem obvious precisely because they were paid for back then. The rules for ground de-icing and snowfall were rewritten. The time during which the protection still works began to be counted more strictly, and a repeat de-icing was required if a plane waited too long to depart. The ban on taking off with any coating of snow and ice on the wing was tightened to the extreme. You can't, and that's that. What had once been a recommendation about a clean wing became a rule with no exceptions. But perhaps the most important lesson had to do not with ice and not with sensors, but with the people in the cockpit. The case of Air Florida 90 became a textbook example of how dangerous silence between pilots can be. The first officer sensed trouble and said so 3 times, but the captain never answered him with action. After disasters like this, the right and the duty of any crew member to insist, and if necessary to stop the takeoff when something is going wrong, became firmly embedded in training. A doubt spoken aloud must become a command, not just a remark. Today this flight is remembered for 2 things at once: for the chain of quiet mistakes that sank a plane in a river in the middle of the capital, and for the people by the water who that same evening proved the opposite, that one decision made in time can save a life. Between the silence in the cockpit and the leap of a passerby into an icy river lies all the difference between tragedy and rescue.